Right, let's move to our register user function. And here, once our function is called, what we want to do is to register a user object. If we jump to our Firebase, here under authentication, currently we have no user. Once we register a user, it will be available here. And by default, you can see what information authenticated user has. So it's the identifier, provider, created, signed in, these are dates, and a user ID. But for our application, we want our user to have much more information in the user object. So we cannot save it here. Let's say we cannot put a username, or we cannot put, I don't know, avatar image link or the age of the user. Here only is the default information required to sign up the user. So what we are going to do instead is, apart from authenticating the user and registering it here, once we get this user ID, which is a unique ID for your application, we are going to use that unique ID also to create another user object, which is totally custom. We can do whatever parameters we want for that user, and we're going to save that user in our database. So this will be our authenticated user area, where you have only the user email address and the user ID. And then we will have in our database the user object that we are going to use, which will have all the information about our user, like date of birth, address, nickname, height, what he's looking for, some short information about him, anything you want, you can add it here. And the storage part, we will save the user images and then link the user image link into our database. So let's get started with our register function. So here we need first to authenticate a user, and once the user is authenticated and we have this unique user ID, we can use that to create a user object in the database as well. So let's create a class. We call it user or Firebase user. I'm going to select the register view controller, Command N, and it's going to be a Swift file. Click next, and let's call this F user, which is short for Firebase user. And for this, we are going to import the Firebase. So let's just say import Firebase, and also import Firebase Okay, the authentication is not required because it's included in the Firebase anyway, so we don't have to separately import that. So I'm going to create a class and call this FUser. And this class is going to also to confirm one protocol, which is called executable. The reason we are confirming these two protocol is we want to check if one user is equals to another user. And basically we are going to compare the user IDs. So if one user has the same user ID as the other user, we are going to get this as a same user. So this is required later on in the course in order to compare users. So I'm going to just go ahead and click fix, because this is the static function required in order to compare two of the class items. Basically it says LHS, which is left hand side, it's an FUser object as our class, and RHS, which is right hand side, and it returns Boolean, is true or false. So basically it says if these two users are equal or no. And what we are going to do is each of our user is gonna have a unique ID. I'm going to call it object ID, and this is gonna be a string. So here we can say that left hand side, which is a FUser object, as you can see here. So if the left hand side dot object ID is equals to right hand side dot object ID, then we are going to return this. So if this is true, the two provided users are equal to each other. So this is like the protocol equitable. If they are not equal, the object IDs, it means these are two different user objects. So without going any further details with our user parameters, I'm going to do them later on. Let's just say this is equals empty string. So this error goes away because we have a variable here, and it's actually constant and it doesn't have a value. So we had to put an initializer in order to silence the error. So I just put the default value to be empty string. So let's write the function that we actually require to register a user object. So then we can take it from there, and based on that we are going to create a fuser object as well in order to save it into our database. So I'm going to create a class function, and I'm going to call this register user with, and this is gonna be with email, which is going to be string, and then the password, which is a string as well. Then I'm going to pass username, which is a string. Basically what we are passing here is, if I just jump to my main store report, you can see all these parameters we are giving to our register function. So we are going to pass all these parameters to it. All right, so we have our username. Then I'm going to put city, which is string as well. Is male, this is gonna be a boolean. And we have date of birth, which is a date object, not data. Make sure you put date, because it's very easy to make this mistake here, especially using the autocomplete. And this is all the parameters we are passing. And what we need to do is to have some kind of callback, because creating a user, authenticating a user in Firebase is going to be happening on a background thread, and we want to be notified once it's done. So I'm going to call a callback function. So we say completion, and once it's completion, we just add escaping, and then we're going to pass the error in case if there was an error, which is an object error, and this is an optional, and this function is not returning anything, so it's void here. Okay, so the reason we create a class function is I want to call this function without initializing an fuser object, and once we call this function, we just provide these parameters, and it's gonna take these parameters, register the user, and then once it's done, it's going to tell our completion that, hey, listen, the registration was done, and it's gonna pass an error. And if the registration was successful, this error is going to be nil, which is nothing. Or if there was an error, we are going to be notified what the error was. So going back to our register function, you can now we can write the code for it. Actually, we can call the required function. So just let's say fuser dot register user with email, and here we are going to pass our email address, which is our email text field dot text, and we can unwrap this. Remember, we are calling the register user function only after our all this is text data inputted returns true. So we are sure that we have some kind of text inside each text field. Otherwise, if you are force unwrapping this and your text email text field or any of the text field happens to have no text, this is gonna crash your application. So whenever you are force unwrapping something with this exclamatory mark, make sure you just check before that if it's nil or no, in order not to crash the application. And we say password text field dot text, force unwrap this, Username is gonna be our username text field dot text. City, again, you just pass city text field dot text, force unwrap this. Is mail is gonna be our variable is mailed that we have set here on top, which is by default true because this is the first value, and then we are changing it once our gender segmented value changed. And looking at the line here, for the current line, this part is not actually necessary, because if we say is mail equals sender segmented index equals 0, so imagine this is in a parenthesis, so whatever the value here is passed to our isMail function. I just put this short statement true false is for you to understand how the short statement works, because you may not have a true or false, but you may call a different function here or print something depending on the value. Otherwise, this part you can remove, and in this case it's gonna be exactly the same result, because the right hand side is either true or false, which is a boolean, in our case isMail. So we are passing isMail here. The date of birth, we are going to have a date picker for our user to be able to choose a date, but right now I'm just going to create a date on the fly, so it's going to be current date, and that's it. We are not going to change anything, we just put the current date there. And this should have a callback completion, and here you just can hit enter, or just say like error in, and put curly braces. Which is our error variable name. You can call this anything you want. It's just for you to understand what it returns. It's best to call whatever you are giving back to through the completion. So we are passing our error. You can put it here, error in. Right, and this part, let's just put a print callback. I'm just going to print this, and also I'm going to jump to my function here, and let's just say print register user. So let's run our application and see if this is actually working. We can call this function here. Now let's go to our sign up, and here by default it doesn't allow me to register, so let's put some dummy information here, just quick, and register. It says registering user, so it means that this function is being called, which is very good. And now we can take all these parameters and create a user object.